And a very good day to you, and welcome to this week's edition of Hindsight. On this program, I get to give my view. On other programs, I get to interview others to get their views on the issues of the day. But on this program, I get to give my views on the issues of the day. No, we start off today with independence. This coming week, Guyana will observe its 55th anniversary of independence. We became independent May 26, 1966. I imagine the majority of the population would have been born after that date, but there are some people who were still around at that time. I was a kid, still in primary school, when we got independence in 1966. And I remember even then sensing the expectancy that accompanied independence. We had a rough few years, starting in 1961 to 1964. We had ethnic violence, and then in 66 came independence. And I think from what I remember and from what I've researched, that all of Guyana came together and welcomed independence. The embrace of Chelly Jagan and Forbes Burnham would be indelibly printed in the minds of those who live through that period. Now, what does independence mean to a country like Guyana? Guyana, of course, is part of the Anglophone Caribbean, the English-speaking Caribbean, and they all got independence. We all got independence starting in 1962. Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica, and then in 1966, Guyana and Barbados. Now, prior to that, there was the West Indies Federation that lasted from 1958 to 1962. And that federation, of course, came to an end when Jamaica held a referendum asking the Jamaicans whether they wanted to stay in the federation or not. And the Jamaicans voted along party lines to opt out of the federation. Of course, Eric Williams, Dr. Eric Williams, the Prime Minister of Trinidad, then said 1 from 10 leaves not, in a sense, signaling the end of the federation. Guyana was not part of the federation. The People's Progressive Party, the PPP, which at that time was the government of the day, refused to take Guyana into the federation. And they argued that Indian Guyanese would become second-class citizens in a West Indies federation. And so the PPP kept Guyana out of the federation. Now that act by the PPP prompted a second split of the PPP. Remember, the first split in the PPP was in 1955 when Forbes Burnham and his faction left the PPP, and they formed what is called the Burnhamite PPP, and we had the Jaganite PPP. J.P. Lachman Singh, Jai Narain Singh, and a number of Burnham supporters left with him in 55. But the left wing of the party, mostly African Guyanese or mixed members such as Sidney King, who is now a UC Guyana, Martin Carter, Rory Westmus, Keith Carter, they stayed on, and Brindley Ben stayed on in the PPP. But on this matter of federation, they felt that Guyana should have been part of the West Indies Federation. And the fact that the PPP did not carry Guyana into that federation prompted the second split when Sidney King, Martin Carter, Rory Westmus, Keith Carter left the party. Excuse me, we don't talk a lot about that second split, largely because there's always the discourse that Burnham split the PPP. And Kwayana argued at that time, he said Dr. Jagan had lost confidence in the African executives of the PPP. And they left the PPP. And that split, that second split, really consolidated the division of the country along ethno-political lines. But Guyana got its independence in 1966, and despite all those setbacks, as I said, there was expectancy. And what was the expectancy at independence? The expectancy at independence was that Guyanese, West Indians would now be free people. I would say the primary objective of independence was freedom. Now, freedom for the ordinary Guyanese, the ordinary West Indian, meant a complete break with colonialism. Because we had endured colonial rule from 1838 when slavery ended to 1966. So slavery ended after 200 and odd years in Guyana in 1838. But then there was this further 128 years of colonial rule, where our country continued to be dominated by the British. The same was the case for Jamaica, Trinidad, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, the rest of the English-speaking Caribbean. And during that period, we had the system of indentureship, where Indians and Chinese and Portuguese were brought to work on the sugar plantations, providing cheap labor. And this was in response to the emancipation of Africans. And Africans had come off the plantation and they had bought their villages and settled in their villages. And as compensation to the planters, the British decided they were going to bring in cheap labor for the planters in the form of indentureship, which lasted from 1838 to 1917. As we know, the Chinese and the Portuguese did not prove to be very useful on the plantation. They could not adapt to the climate and so forth. And then Indian Guyanese came and they were more adaptable to the climate. And so independence came in 1966, the expectancy of freedom. Freedom. Now, in the first decade of independence, Guyana experienced some break with colonial rule. The PNC came to power in 1964 in a coalition with the United Force. And so it was the PNC which was in power when independence came. Forbes Burnham as the first prime minister in an independent Guyana. The first decade of independence, Burnham took a very progressive position, both in terms of domestic policy and the foreign policy. And that Burnham's ideology, like that of the other his other contemporaries in the rest of the English-speaking Caribbean, Errol Barrow, Eric Gary, Eric Williams, Michael Manley, who was to come to power in Jamaica in 1972. They all took the position that the state should be used as a vehicle for uplifting the masses of Guyanese. There were two big consequences of colonial rule. One consequence was economic, in the sense that prior to independence, the Guyanese and the West Indian workers, they produced everything for export to to Britain. And so therefore, at the time of independence, they were inheriting an economy that was not geared to economic development internally, because you're exporting everything you produce. And now the British were gone, at least formally, and so we had to deal with the question of a monoculture economy, an economy that produced one major product, which was sugar. How do you move an economy from a plantation to a thriving modern economy? That was one of the challenges of independence. How do we move from plantation to nation? The challenges of independence. But there was another big challenge of independence, and that was the world in which we lived in 1966. Remember the end of the Second World War, the British and the Americans and the Russians, the Soviets at that time, and all the other victors of the Second World War got together in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in the United States, and they came up with a new world order, which was supposed to bring an end to wars among the big nations, that they felt that they needed to come to some agreement that they would no longer be war. And they came up with some regulatory agencies, so to speak, to control the world. One such agency was the International Monetary Fund, which was aimed at controlling and regulating the world's finances. They came up with the World Bank, which was created to help to rebuild Europe, which was devastated by the war, and that this bank would provide resources for the redevelopment of Europe. And then, of course, they came up with what we know today as the World Trade Organization, an organization which was meant to control world trade. And so they created a world order that was going to be dominated by the big countries, because it was their interest that the war had ended and they were looking after their interests when they met in Bretton Woods. The other development was the Cold War, which began in the late 1940s, a competition between the Soviet Union and the United States for control of the world. That Cold War would last for 40 years, coming to an end in the late 1980s. And so for 40 years, the world was forced to take choices, to make choices. You're either with the United States, which promoted an economic system of capitalism, or the Soviet Union, which promoted an economic system of socialism. And so there were different views of the world, different views about how common resources will be distributed. And these two economic systems were buttressed by huge military. Military spending went up. There was competition about who would go to space. And there was competition about who will control which part of the world, what we call the spheres of influence. And Guyana and the rest of the English-speaking Caribbean were just next door to the United States. In 1959, the Cuban Revolution happened. Clean break with the West and an alignment with the Soviet Union. And Cuba, of course, is sitting 90 miles off the coast of America, 90 miles off the coast of Florida there. And so therefore, when Guyana became independent in 1966, it became independent in a world that was not created for it. When the New World Order was created after the war, when the Cold War started in the late 40s, Guyana did not exist as a sovereign country. The English-speaking Caribbean did not exist as sovereign countries. And so we entered a world that did not cater for us. The world did not cater for countries coming out of slavery and colonialism and making the quest for total freedom. What freedom for Guyana and the English-speaking Caribbean would mean is economic independence, that there could be no economic development in Guyana and the rest of the Caribbean if they're still linked to the colonial world, because it was colonialism that stultified economic growth in Guyana. And so if we were going to be free, we had to be economically free. And in order to be economically free, there had to be some form of self-determination, political freedom. So those were the two quests: economic freedom and political freedom. Now, in the global order at that time, in the context of the Cold War at that time, economic and political independence for small, newly independent countries like Guyana was a no-no. The Americans would tolerate no economic organization that is not capitalist. And the Soviets were prepared to support any country that veered away from capitalism. That was the world that we entered. And so when Mr. Burnham and Mr. Manley in Jamaica and Eric Williams and others went for economic nationalism, political independence, they were seen as suspicious. The West did not like any country veering away. We know that the West intervened in Guyana in 1961 to 64. They intervened in Jamaica from 72 to 80. They intervened in Grenada with the ousting of the Grenadian Revolution in 1983. And they were involved, both sides I imagine, in other countries trying to keep the Caribbean from going capitalist, and the Soviets trying to pull the Caribbean towards going socialist. Now, slavery was born out of capitalism. The first capital in capitalism were slaves. That was the capital. You have to have capital to have capitalism. And slavery was the backbone of early capitalism. Eric Williams wrote the book, Capitalism and Slavery. And colonialism continued that system of exploitation for the building of wealth for the capitalist world. And so countries that became independent could not turn to capitalism as a form of freedom. So you found a lot of these countries turn to some kind of socialism. Guyana called it cooperative socialism. Manley called it democratic socialism. Some countries like Barbados did not use the term socialism, but their policies pointed to that direction. So we entered a world that was not made for us. And so any decisions made in Guyana or Trinidad or Jamaica, Grenada, had to be determined by the external forces. American foreign policy said very clearly that they would not tolerate any country that veered away from capitalism or that was in support of the Soviet Union. That is the reality. Like Bess said, that our economic and political decisions were taken offshore, meaning outside of our countries. So we had that big challenge to our independence, the state of the global environment. And then we had our own internal problems. We had our internal problem of ethnicity. Although the disturbances of the 1960s had ended, nevertheless, the problem remained. The ethnic problem remained. So we had the ethnic problem to contend with. How are we going to bring together these ethnic groups that have developed a sense of distrust between and among them? The ethnic groups, mainly the African Guyanese and the Indian Guyanese, had begun to behave like historical enemies. They were not historical enemies. Neither group enslaved the other. So they were not historical enemies. But they were fighting over the independent state. As the British were leaving, the question was, who will govern? Will it be African Guyanese or Indian Guyanese? That was a fundamental question, and it's still a fundamental question we have to grapple with. It's the ethnic challenge to our independence. We talked about the global challenge. We have the ethnic challenge. Again, we have not been able to solve that problem 55 years after independence. It remains a guillotine around the neck of Guyana. Then we had a third challenge as far as independence is concerned, and that was ideology. What would be the ideological development of the ideological alignment of the forces? Meaning, what kind of development it will be? What would be the content of the development? Are we going to do some quasi-capitalism? Are we going to be socialist? Are we going to be radically nationalist? And that conversation about the content of independence was really between the independence leaders, the Burnhams, the Jagans, the Williamses, the Barrows, the Garys, the Verboord, the John Compton, St. Lucia. The question was that they are taking power, and some of them opted for radical change, most of them opted for a more reformist position, a more reformist ideological position. But then you had young men and women who had grown up with the independence movement, and they'd gone to study, most of them at the University of the West Indies, but some still went to Canada and America and England. And this generation of leaders, younger leaders, what I call the sons, if the Burnhams and Eric Williams and them were the fathers, then this younger generation of people like Maurice Bishop and Walter Rodney and Tim Hector and George Odlum, Dr. Gonzalez, these were the sons who, as I said, were, for the first time, we were having graduates from the University of the West Indies. They were getting a Caribbean education. During the colonial period, they were getting a colonial education. Now they were getting a Caribbean education. They were learning that Cuba is not a bad place. They were reading Che Guevara. They were reading Kwame Nkrumah. And so this new generation wanted a complete break with colonialism. The older generation that had taken the reins of government and independence thought that they could make a complete break. But confronted with a global world that was against radical change, they opted for reform. The exceptions would be Burnham, who for the first decade went aggressively in using the state for social reform, Michael Manley, democratic socialism. Barbados had a traditional welfare state based on the English model. So too the Trinidadians and the others. So you had the clash between these sons and daughters who wanted a clean break, and the leaders who were there in power who, based on experience, wanted a more gradual change. Clive Thomas and Havelock Brewster, they wrote a seminal book, Dependence and Transformation, in which they argue that for Guyana and the Caribbean to be transformed, there must be a clean break with colonialism. And so this competition for ideas, this concourse of ideas, this argument about what the nature of independence should be, what the content of independence should be, began to have political overtones. Because the young sons and daughters felt that in order to make a clean break, you had to have revolution. And so we entered the 60s and the 70s, a period of revolution. Brother Valentino, the Calypsonian, calls it the Roaring 70s. Roaring 70s. In 1970, there was the February Revolution led by Geddes Granger, later become McCandle Dagger. These were young students who were influenced by Black Power. And they almost overthrew the government in Trinidad and Tobago. Prior to that, we had the 1968 riots in Jamaica. Then Walter Rodney was banned from that country. And the Jamaican working people and the Rastafarians took to the streets to protest the banning of a West Indian national who wanted to teach African history at the University of the West Indies. Later on, we would have the Grenadian Revolution in 1979. We had the Surinamese Revolution in 1980, February 1980. In 1979, Patrick John was the independence leader there, was ousted by a mass uprising. Patrick John. He was friends with Mr. Burnham. So we had Gary gone, Patrick John gone. We had the February Revolution in 1970. Patrick John of Dominica. In St. Lucia, they did not have a popular uprising, but the left-wing forces joined together and they went into the traditional party, the St. Lucia Labour Party, and they won the election in 1979, a mini revolution. In 1979, you had the St. Vincent uprising where the Union Island, the Grenadines, wanted to secede from St. Vincent. And they had an uprising led by Rastafarians. Out of that incident came the popular song by the mighty Gabby of Barbados, Boots, Boots, and More Boots. It was a calypso criticizing Barbados for sending troops into St. Vincent to help them to beat back the Union Island uprising in 1979. Michael Manley had opted for democratic socialism, and so the left wing in Jamaica gave critical support to Manley. In Guyana, Walter Rodney had come back home in 1974, And he joined the WPA, which argued that although Burnham's cooperative socialism was progressive, the price that we had to pay for it, meaning the decline of human rights, the violation of human rights, the creation of the single dominant party. In 1974, the PNC had declared the paramountcy of the party, which says that the PNC was paramount over the state. The PNC flag was flown over the appeal court, the high court. And so the radicals felt that, yes, social reform, such as nationalization, which they supported, such as national service, such as the housing scheme, such as all those programs to lift the poor. They supported most of those programs, but they felt that democracy was being challenged. And so therefore, we had the conflict between the WPA and the PNC. Now, I give all of this background to say we had three major challenges. The external challenge, or the global challenge, we had the ethnic challenge, and now we have the ideological challenge. I'm making the point here that independence has not been easy. Trying to decide what kind of society we're going to be. Let us fast forward now to 2021, on this our 55th anniversary. I am arguing in my column in the Village Voice this week that the single most important challenge today is the challenge to our very sovereignty. Guyana has become an oil producing country. It has large deposits of oil. And once a small country, just down the road from the United States and Canada, and of course the old European masters are there, they are never going to allow a small country to control that amount of wealth. Because with economic wealth, one of the outcomes could be economic independence. And if a country becomes economic independent, it can more likely become politically independent. The only country in the Caribbean that is politically independent and economically independent is Cuba. And you know that the Americans has had the longest embargo, trade embargo. 60 years on Cuba, a punishment of Cuba for being economically and politically independent. The same thing happened to Haiti. The Americans did not recognize Haiti until 1865. The Haitian Revolution was in triumph in 1804. The French, with the support of the Americans, strangled the Haitian Revolution. And so this coming of oil and gas theoretically could open the door for real freedom in Guyana, because we now have wealth. We don't have to depend on the Americans and the British for loans and so on, and for grants. And we now could deal with poverty theoretically. And like I said, with that amount of wealth, our voice will become bigger theoretically in the world. But that is looking at it from the Guyana standpoint. From the standpoint of the big countries, they will have to control this place called Guyana. This place that had Marxists and had socialist experience. This place that has a tradition of resistance. This place that has a tradition of nationalism. Whatever you say about Burnham and Williams and Manley and Bird and Gary and Jagan and them, they believe in a place called the Caribbean. They believe in a place called Guyana. They were anti-imperialists. One time, the three major parties in Guyana were all left-wing. The PNC called itself Marxist-Leninist. The PPP called itself Communist. And the WP at that time called itself Independent Socialist. The only country in the world where the three major parties were all left-wing. Remarkable. So this country now has found oil. And the big countries remember that. They obviously now want to control the oil. And to control the oil, you have to control the politics, the political direction of the country. You have to control the economic policies of the country. Unfortunately for us, our 2020 election was conducted against that background, where external forces, from their standpoint, cannot afford a truly independent Guyana. It will not be in their interest. It'll be another Cuba. So the 2020 election became the occasion for fixing Guyana. Who governs? At the time of independence, the question was who governs? Now we have found oil, the question is who governs? So the 2020 election was not about winning and losing, it was about who governs. And that had to be dictated by external forces in collusion with internal forces. And the global forces and sections of the domestic environment, first of all, decided that a government like the one that was in power, the coalition government, is not a good option. You talk to diplomats from the United States and they will tell you, the United States always felt whatever the PNC is, and they have done, they were more of a nationalist party than the PPP. The PPP, spouted communism. They believed in it like it was their Bible. But their communism operated within the context of ethnic domination, one, and two, collusion with external forces. That is why it was so easy when the PPP came back to power in 1992. They could enter into an alliance with the Americans, who they theoretically hated. But they were not as anti-imperialist, although they were communists. They were not as anti-imperialist as the PNC. And there's some sociological reasons for that. The main support base of the PNC are descendants of enslaved Africans who have had a longer anti-imperialist, anti-empire Because they had to fight it from slavery, came right through colonialism. The supporters of the PPP came later in 1838, and although they developed anti-imperialist tendencies, it is not as long as the Africans. I suppose they may want to do a number on me that they did on Amanza Desir, because I'm making a comparative analysis of this way in which the two groups have been socialized there. Africans had a longer anti-imperialist because of enslavement. And so you'll find African leaders, not all of them, but most of them tend to be instinctively anti-imperialist. And while there are East Indians, Indian Guyanese leaders who are anti-imperialist, I'm arguing that it is not as strongly rooted as the other ethnic group. The Amerindians, for example, have had their lands stolen by the Europeans. But because of that longer control of the Amerindians by European forces through the church, their anti-imperialist instincts are a little bit dimmed too. So, the big forces in 2020 had to make the choice about who governs. And they made the decision that the PPP is a better choice for them. I am theorizing that that choice is based on what they see as a weaker anti-imperialist instinct among the leadership of the PPP. And the second reason that they chose the PPP is that they think that the PPP will be much more accommodating of global capitalism. Thirdly, I think they feel that the PPP is much more vulnerable because of the ways in which its leadership, sections of its leadership, have been involved in illicit activity. Well, let me restate that the PPP's leadership has been more complicit with the underworld, what Clive Thomas called the criminalization of the state, where the PPP fused the state and the underworld. And so the PPP leadership is much more vulnerable. You can blackmail them easier than you can do with most of the PNC leadership. And so I think those three factors the less robust anti-imperialism of the PPP, at least starting from 1992, the vulnerability of PPP leaders to be blackmailed, and the PPP's move towards accommodating global capitalism. And so therefore, they opted for regime change of the coalition. How did that regime change work? The PPP was advised to delegitimize the government at home and abroad. That's the coalition government. And they were secretly spending millions and millions of dollars with groups and organizations in the United States to paint the coalition government as a terrible government. Because you have to do that. To bring about regime change, you have to get the OS on board. You have to get CARICOM on board. You have to get the Commonwealth on board. You have to get sections of the US leadership in the Congress on board. And the way you do that is you paint. You hire lobbyists to paint the coalition as the most evil government. That's the first step towards regime change. You have to paint the regime as terrible. And you do so with catchwords. And the catchword was democracy. And that the coalition was violating democracy. The second thing that they did is that they anticipated and predicted to these organizations and people around the world that the coalition was going to rig the election. So the elections were not held yet, but they began to spread the word around that these people will rig the election. And it was believable because the main coalition party, the PNC, was involved in rigged elections back in the 60s and the 70s. So it was more believable to people who were not paying attention to know that the PNC of the 70s and 80s is not the PNC of today. The PNC of today turned its face against rigged election. It agreed to free and fair election in 1992. And secondly, it has opted for coalition politics. You can't argue that that's still the Burnhamite PNC. It's a new PNC, but they needed to give the impression that these people are going to rig the elections. The third thing they did, and this is where the PPP comes in, was to paint the coalition government as a racist government against East Indians, against Amerindians. Remember the big narrative that as soon as the coalition came, it knocked off a whole set of Amerindians? It wasn't true. And then, as the coalition tried to deal with the sugar industry, we were producing sugar, and we are at 40 cents a pound and selling it at 13 cents, which means we are subsidizing those who are buying, who are the Europeans. And what the PPP was able to do is to frame that not in economic terms, but in racial terms. Here was this government putting East Indians out of work. And that stuck. So the government is now painted as patently racist. And then the fourth thing that they did was to encourage a breaking of the ranks, a betrayal of trust within the coalition, but a betrayal, I think, of the Constitution. When Mrs. Sharon Das, we now know, with the collusion of external forces who accommodated his flight from Guyana when he was finished voting against his own coalition. So they used the Constitution because one could vote against, it's not against the Constitution, it's not against the letter of the Constitution, but it's against the spirit of the Constitution, what Sharon Das did. Violated the spirit of the Constitution. But he was helping that by external forces. He fled to Canada. So that's the fourth thing they do. They facilitated a coup in December of 2019. A coup. And then they moved to the courts. Our courts have never dealt with electoral matters in ways that they were dealt with at this last election. They would deal with elections petition here and there, but our courts have not been experienced in dealing with electoral matters. It's not their thing. Our courts really are courts that look at criminal law and sometimes business and so on, but the political thing, we have not had a robust review, constitutional, judicial review, sorry. And so here were the courts now called upon to rule on important matters. One, the court had to rule on who can become chair of the Elections Commission. And the court's ruling led to Mr. Granger having to get rid of his choice for Elections Commission chairman. Critically, the court had to rule on the voters list. The voters list was very bloated, 600 and something thousand people on a list that is in a country of 700 and something people, impossible. But the court ruled that people could not be taken off the voters list like that. In order to do that, you'll have to amend the law, but based on the law before the court made that crucial ruling. So we got a new chairman of the commission, and then that chairman of the commission stopped the household registration, which would have given us a new voters list. Those are the factors that were used to host the coalition from government. Now, I'm not saying that the coalition didn't do its own fair share of stupidness. It made mistakes, but it was not a racist government, did not practice systematic discrimination against Indians. It did not violate human rights. In fact, it has the best human rights record of any government in Guyana's history, including the present one. But the regime change had the support of powerful forces. Canada, the British, the Europeans, the Americans threw their might behind that regime change. They validated narratives of one side. They used their diplomatic clout, for example, to help Sharon Das to get out. And so by the time election day, 3/4 of the work was done. And after election, they went into Ashmin's and they carried out what they had predicted to the rest of the world. They took control of the process to argue that the elections was being rigged. They basically took over the elections headquarters under the guise that the elections were being rigged. So as Vincent Alexander said, and I agree with him, that whole business of rigged election and Mr. Mingo doing this and Mr. Mingo doing that was not meant to correct any election. What it was meant to do is to declare the elections as rigged elections. And once you declare the elections as rigged elections, you then now are calling on forces to come in and rescue Guyana from this attempt at derailing electoral democracy. The OS came in, the CARICOM came in, the Commonwealth came in, the IRI came in, all the observer groups, and they said rigged elections. Ranger must go. The matter went to the court, but again, our courts took a conservative position. Our courts are on these matters, our Guyanese and Caribbean jurisprudence tend to be very conservative. The CCJ did not have the authority to hear the case, elections case, because it was clear that the appeal court, based on our constitution, must have the last say on elections, and that the CCJ own charter prohibited it from hearing any case where the domestic court is the court of last resort on a matter. Yet the CCJ took, they took the case, took control of the case. They argued that as the apex court of Guyana, they had the right to hear that case. No, I'm making the argument here, not that the court was in collusion with the external conspirators and the internal conspirators. I'm arguing that the conservative jurisprudence in Guyana served as the perfect foil for regime change. That is, those who were engaged in regime change took advantage of the conservative jurisprudence. You know, a lot of people think that, you know, Roxanne George is this and that. I'm not going there. I'm not interested in that. I'm saying that the jurisprudence in Guyana, as far as elections are concerned, the courts here and the rest of the Caribbean have been very conservative. They tend to err on the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law. Take, for example, this matter that the Chief Justice just ruled on. Our position was Section 22 gave GCOM the right to make changes, and that GCOM carried out that right. So it cannot be unconstitutional. What she didn't deal with was the extent to which GCOM could make laws. What is the cutoff point? Based on our ruling, as you all know, GCOM can now do anything when it comes to election. If our ruling is allowed to stand, it would mean that GCOM could do anything. What that would mean is that once a political party get a chairman of GCOM in there, along with their 3 commissioners, they'll be able to make any changes in any election. That is what we're facing, and that's regime change. Taking advantage of the conservative nature of the court. And then the worst thing that was done with the regime change is when the Americans took the position that there are two competitors in an election, they're going to put sanctions on one competitor to determine the outcome of the election. The sanctions were meant to pressure the PNC AFC coalition to get out of office. There are reports that the Secretary of State called Mr. Granger and gave him an ultimatum. No, that is not being verified because Mr. Granger has not spoken and the Secretary of State has not spoken. We are hearing that the American president also got involved. These are things that we cannot verify for now. But what we know is that sanctions were placed. The first time in the history of Guyana that sanctions were placed on one competitor. We have had elections that have been tampered with in Guyana for a long time. But we never had sanctions. And with the imposition of sanctions, that was an overt way of interfering with the election to determine its outcome. And I'm arguing here this morning that all the other factors that I spoke about, the final nail was the sanctions. You may want to sanction people after an election, but you're sanctioning them during an election means that you use the might of the United States state to determine the outcome of the election in another country named Guyana. So here we are after the installation of the new government, the PPP. And the PPP says, we are going to change the electoral laws. And we are bringing in the IRI either to do it for us or after we catch them, they're also saying that IRI will not do it, but they will use their consultants. Do you all believe that the IRI, which took a side during the election impasse, will advise the government to institute any law, any election law that will put the PPP at a disadvantage or that would put the opposition on even footing with the PPP? No. Whatever electoral laws that come from the collusion of IRI and the government will be to give the PPP an advantage. I don't know. They said they're going to. The law is being drafted, and the opposition will get to bite at it. Why can't the opposition help to draft the law? If you, in a critical area like electoral reform, are very interested in consensus, you don't show me something that you do. You call me to the table and say, we work this thing out together. Let us draft it together. But no, the PPP is going to use its majority in parliament to ram electoral laws that would not be fair to all. Those electoral laws would benefit the PPP. And they're going to use their parliamentary majority to ram those laws through. They're going to tell the opposition, we are consulting you. But we are not asking for consultation, and the opposition ought not to ask for just consultation. They should ask for active participation from beginning to end. But the PPP is not going to grant that. They're clear. They said the WPA is wrong. That IRI will not spare it. The government will spare it, but IRI will provide the consultants. Are you here? And they're going to use their majority in parliament to push that through. It is why I have concluded in my column this week in the Village Voice that Guyana can say goodbye to free and fair elections, or to elections that are not tampered with by external forces. The tampering of the next election has begun now. It has begun with this electoral reform. So, on this 55th anniversary of independence, we can say goodbye for now. Goodbye to elections that are free from external tampering. This is what the meaning of regime change is. That you put a regime in place that is going to carry out, going to marry its own interests with the interests of global forces. The PPP doesn't mind if Exxon and the big companies carry away 80% of our oil revenue, and the 20% they're going to give to their cronies. They don't mind that. They don't mind giving away 80% to get 20%. That is what we're in the face of. That is what the mangroves are all about. The reneging of the PPP on the renegotiation of the contract. The reneging on assurances that they will protect the environment. They're not. They're not. They're prepared to kill the environment. They're prepared to go light on the oil companies so that they can get their 20 or 25% of revenue to put in the pockets of their rich supporters. This morning news, they're saying that the National Resource Fund, they're going to pass laws to make it easier to get the money out. That's what they're after. And they're prepared to give away Guyana to get that. And of course, to get political power. The big companies and the big countries, they're not going to come in and rule, but they're going to ensure that their puppets rule. So, sisters and brothers, there you have it on this independence anniversary. At the end of the day, when you take all of that I've said here into consideration, you're talking about recolonization. Our independence was always fragile because of the factors I spoke about up front. And so it was always subject to interference. But 2020 has taken us right back to 1966, pre-1966. If you cannot control who governs, you are not free. If you cannot control your natural resources and what flow from it, you are not free. Don't want to be pessimistic. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to lay out the reality. Now, the people of Guyana will have to decide whether they're going to stop this scheme or not. It is a matter for their people and their political leaders. But I'm submitting that the coalition leaders, their major objective at this juncture in our history is to try to push back against the recolonization of Guyana, against the recolonization of our electoral system. Any electoral reform must first of all start with the compilation of a voters list. And not just compiling the voters list, but ensuring that the voters list is constantly sanitized. People die, get them off. People migrate, get them off. You can have a good voters list, but if you don't keep updating it and sanitizing it, it becomes a bad voters list. So we have to have laws, not just to have to compile the list, but to monitor the list and to sanitize it. That's the first electoral reform that is needed. The second electoral reform that is needed is a GCOM itself. We have to have a GCOM machinery. It's not easily manipulated by one party or the other. You know, divided countries are going to be very difficult to find people who are neutral. But the laws that you put in place must ensure transparency. And finally, how do we conduct our elections on election day? In 1992, we made it possible for the votes to be counted at the place of polling. But now we know that votes can be counted at the place of polling and they're still not valid votes. So the conduct of election on election day is most important. And finally, what is a valid vote? In the old days, a valid vote was a vote that is not spoiled, which is what they use there. But the Guyana Court of Appeal said that once you did that recount, the definition of what is a valid vote changes. Is a box without statutory documents? Are those votes valid? If people migrate 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and the name is still on the voters list, and somebody voted for them, is that a valid vote? Somebody dead, and somebody voted for them, is that a valid vote? We have to pass laws accepted by everyone to determine what is a valid vote. We come at two sets of votes. One that arose from a naked count of the votes in the box, and one that arose from an audit of the votes in the box. And they choose the naked votes over the audited votes. What kind of nonsense are you telling me that that is democracy? It is not. You set out in the recount order to find out whether the PPP's charge of rigging was true. And you did an audit and you found that out. The charge of rigging was true, except it was they who were rigging. You didn't find boxes without statutory documents in Linden or Buxton or Pleasance or South Georgetown. You found them with places of particular names, which the PPP will tell you is their stronghold. You can ignore that. The court said that they could ignore it. But you have to bring it now to an elections petition. And when you take it to the elections petition, the court said there's a technical problem here. Granger was served late. Throw it out. The conservative nature of the court, which went beyond the letter and take into consideration the spirit that this is a petition that is important to the future of this country. A court that took into consideration the spirit would not have thrown that out. Again, I said, I'm not interested in Ulox and George, Justice George, voting for, or which party should think. I'm not interested in that. Our ruling was conservative. It relied more on the letter than on the spirit. That's my argument. And in doing that, the court is unwittingly aiding and abetting regime change. Unwittingly. I don't think the court set out to do that. So I'm not questioning the right of the court to make rulings. The court make rulings, you gotta go by it until you can change. But as a political scientist, I am making the argument that the regime changes took advantage of the conservative jurisprudence. And so that system, that judicial system, ends up unwittingly aiding and abetting regime change. So now IRI and the government are going to change the electoral laws. And the opposition will get two bites. The opposition will not get to sit down and to frame. Sit down in the Constitutional Reform Committee, come up with terms of reference, come up with the broad framework of the law, and then give it to the Attorney General office to draft. No, that's not how they're doing it. The Attorney General office is drafting it, and the consultants are coming from the IRI. And then they're going to give the opposition two bites. I say no to that. And you, Guyanese, should say no to it. And the opposition should say no to it. They need to stand up. They need to stand up erect. You may lose in the end, but go down fighting. Go down fighting. You may lose. They may still ram it through the parliament. But at least fight back. Do not accept fiat accompli. So, on this 55th anniversary, here we are. Here we are. Goodbye to the elections in Guyana that would not be tampered with by external forces and some internal forces, a collusion. I wish on this day I could give another message, but we have to tell the truth. Unless the scheme between the IRI and the government of Guyana is turned back, goodbye to elections that are not being tampered with. The tampering with the next election has started. I hope I've been able to clarify some things here this morning to give you a sense of the challenges we face. We still face global challenges. Venezuela is next door. Venezuela is a target of regime changers in big countries. They want a country next door that is friendly to them, a government that is friendly to them. They want to be able to make as much money from our oil and gas as they could make without the hassle. And in order to get a hassle-free environment in which to operate, you install a government that is friendly to you. There we are. To those of you young ones who were born after 1966, it's your world, your country. You all have got to stand up for your country. The tampering with the police force, very important institution. It's the institution of law and order. You take advantage of the conservative jurisprudence in the courts, and now you have to control the other arm, the coercive arm. Try to rig the elections in the police association to put representatives in charge of that association that are friendly to you. When the PPP came back to power in 92, it encouraged Indians to join the police force. Not many of them did. So they moved to strategy number 2. Strategy number 2 was to control the leadership of the police force. They succeeded to a large extent in doing that. Now they're going one step further. They are painting African Guyanese leaders in the police force as scoundrels, as thieves, as rapists. What you're saying to rank and file police men and women, don't mess with the PPP, or else you'll get the ball slow action. That's what they're saying to young rank and file police, that we are going to hang you out to dry. We're going to put the might of the state on you. They're inducing fear in the police force. You can't get a majority of your people in the police force. You can control some of the leaders, but not all of them. So you're now trying strategy number 3. Fear. And they're doing that in front of our very faces. It's all part of the grand strategy of control, dominance. To dominate a society, you have to be able to dominate the major institutions. You dominate parliament because you have a majority there in that executive branch. You're taking advantage of the court, the ideological orientation of the court, the judicial branch. And the executive branch, which has control of the police force and the army and so on, you're not breaking the morale in the army, in the police. You're now instilling fear in them so that when you're ready, because the PPP must know that if they continue going down the road, they will have to deal with resistance. And they're making the police force in their own image so they can get those police force to go and shoot down poor people and Black people on the streets. The response to the resistance that must come has started by tampering with the police force. So you tamper with votes, the electoral system, and now you're tampering with the police force. It's systematic. Politics is not just about this incident and that incident that is isolated. They're all part of a process. So here we are, on the 55th anniversary of independence. The message is a grim one. I can't sit there and say in 55 years we've made no progress. God damn it, we've survived. We have survived. And we have survived because the people, the ordinary people, made us survive. We've made some bold steps and they've paid dividends. I'm a child of independence. I could not get a university education and all of that if steps were not made to make university affordable to poor people. So we've made some progress. But at the end of the day, we are back to where we were in 1966. So we've got to keep the struggle up. We've got to continue to struggle. We've got to continue to educate and each other. We've got to support each other because the burden of saving our country from complete recolonization lies with those who are in opposition. Those who have power would not touch the privilege that comes with that power. It is those of us who are outside of the power structure who will have to lead the fight. We'll have to lead the fight. So, pick up your Village Voice news. Those of you who are not at home, you can take out a subscription for some family member at home. Or you can just take out a couple of subscriptions so they can drop the paper to people who you may not know. But you have to support that paper. That paper has to move from a Sunday paper to a more regular paper, and it needs support. So go make a donation and let them know that that donation is meant to give a subscription or subscriptions to people at home. You all can support my program, which is now here on Facebook, but now on Channel 9, because we want to broaden the message. To those who are not able to come on Facebook, they can see it on television. And so you can support us. Hindsight is on Sunday. During the week is Politics 101, Tuesday and Thursday. This coming week, I will be looking at the economic hard times. I'm going to have a couple of economists to come on to explain to us why the prices are going up. The PPP is telling us all kinds of things. But we're going to have our economist who's going to tell us exactly what's going on in the economy. And then I'm going to have some reflections on independence on Tuesday. Hopefully, some people who are there, I will try to get some of the veterans. Not many of them are still around, but I'll try to. And try to get a couple of younger people to reflect on independence. But you've gotten my reflection today. So make sure you share this link. People may not be on now, but you can share the program so that people can see it. Some people are saying it was quite educational. I'm glad. I'm a teacher, among other things, and I teach. All right. So share the program, and like I said, support Hindsight, support Politics 101 in whatever small way you can. So until next week, This is David Hinds saying thank you for indulging me, staying with me, and keep the struggle going. That's my message.